Good morning, Southern California grant makers. I remember my first annual conference. It was 2001. SCG was then SCAP, and the conference featured a young writer, Malcolm Gladwell, someone who wasn't quite the household name then that he is now. Mr. Gladwell has a way of taking complex issues and making them powerfully simple and compelling. Our next speaker has a similar gift. Arnold Chandler is an advocate, researcher, internet strategist, and principal of Forward Change Consulting based in Oakland, California. We are in for a real treat this morning. Arnold and his partner, Tia Martinez, have created a remarkable tool, the Life Course Framework. You'll see Arnold's focus on equity, advocacy, economic and community development through his analysis. And over the next 45 minutes or so, Arnold will introduce us to the Life Course, layer by layer, to help explain how disadvantaged populations become disconnected from opportunity. Much of Arnold's analysis is rooted in boys and men of color, and he will tell you that this framework can be used for any population, girls, elders, wealthy and poor. Whether you fund in early childhood or workplace development or anywhere in between, there will be something this morning to tickle, rivet, and possibly really unsettle you in what you hear from what Arnold shares. I promise you that it'll feel like gulping from a fire hydrant. I promise you that an hour won't be nearly enough. We will have time at the end to take a few questions for Arnold. But to add some context to this, I wanted to introduce you to a young man who, even at 20 years of age, has navigated a life course with many twists and turns. Someone who's known hardship and more recently opportunity, and yet only very recently, as recent as October 10th, his life took a dramatic turn in a split second. A young man who we know through work at Liberty Hill, the California Endowment, Brotherhood Crusade, and California Community Foundation through our Brother Sun Selves and Bloom initiatives. Let's meet Samaje Clark.
Monday, October 19th, I'm Tina Tyus-Shaw.
And I'm Andrew Davis. Thanks so much for joining us. He's a young man who's devoted his life to promoting nonviolence, then shot on his trip to Savannah.
Now, as he recovers from his gunshot wound, he talks to News 3 about what happened. Samaje Clark came to Savannah on an anti-violence campaign, showing authorities here what has worked for young people in Los Angeles. Clark was shot in Yamacraw Village during a robbery attempt. And News 3's Courtney Cole is following this story and tells us how he's doing.
Now, Tina, despite the fact that doctors told them that he will never walk again, Samaje Clark remains in good spirits tonight. He tells me that he doesn't look at this experience here in Savannah as a setback, rather just another reason to help youth turn their lives in a more positive direction.
It really hurts a lot, to know that, I won't be able to walk again, because one thing I like to do is I like to run. I run to get rid of my pain. I like to go running and stuff like that. So just to know.
Samaje Clark traveled more than 2,000 miles from Los Angeles to Savannah, hoping to change things for the better here.
I came out here for a community safety forum. They're trying to make it better, because I see that a lot of stuff that's going on out there is happening in South LA. So it's really similar to the stuff that's going on.
As a youth ambassador, Clark says he knows change is possible. City leaders just need to take a different approach.
There's a lot of stuff that's going on in LA, but we come up with different propositions and bills to get it passed, and we get them passed, and they actually help. So that's what I think should go on here.
He also says mentorship will play a big part in stopping the violence.
I think it starts in the home, really, and it's crazy. That's why we need mentors to help, because we don't know what's going on in these homes. And a mentor comes into play to help keep the child's mind right and help them develop correctly, because it's hard to try to do good when there's no good around you.
And he encountered some of that negativity during his visit, but says it won't stop him from reaching his goal.
Like I won't be able to walk in that. Like that hurts me, but it's not going to stop me from doing what I got to do. So I'm just gonna stay out here, and I'm just gonna try to make a difference.
Now, Clark tells me after he finishes rehabilitation, he wants to work with Savannah's leaders to make a positive change in the lives of kids here. If you would like to help Clark and his mother with any of the medical costs, visit our website and search Making a Change. Courtney Cole, WSAV News 3.
You all may recognize Samaje from a series of columns that LA Times' Sandy Banks wrote on him, one back in May and then one since he was shot and paralyzed. As Coot Blackson said a few moments ago, there's a certain sacrifice that we make through service, and I think through what we see with Samaje from his hospital bed, he certainly is living that truth. So as we as foundations collaborate to bring systemic change to close the opportunity gap, I'm excited to present to you someone who's done a lot of work in helping us to understand the life course of disadvantaged communities. Let's welcome Arnold Chandler. Thank you.
Wow. I'm quite a bit affected by that video. Yeah. I have to admit, putting in perspective, what's up here is often synthesizing research as somewhat of an academic enterprise, an intellectual enterprise. Seeing a young man still committed to his purpose after being shot, after actually seeing what he's fighting against reach up and take away his freedom to walk is profound to me. So I'm honored to follow his story and do this presentation in light of his story. So this presentation is a life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations. And in this particular application of this presentation, I'm going to focus on boys and men of color. And the reason that this presentation focuses on boys and men of color is because it was actually the work on boys and men of color that led to this work, led to the creation of this. And so that was its inspiration and its practical application right now. But the important thing to note is that what I'm going to talk about here is applicable to any disadvantaged population. And mostly what I focus on are young folks between the ages of 0 and 35 into middle adulthood. And so that's the population that I want you to keep in mind in terms of thinking about how this applies broadly. But what I want to talk about are a couple things. The first thing that I'm going to do is frame some trend lines, and not even all of the most important ones, because that would be an hour-and-a-half presentation, but some very critical ones that over the past 40 years have been converging in powerful ways to produce very profound disadvantages among communities, particularly magnified through the experiences of males of color. But there are some things that I'm going to leave out, obviously, for sake of time. But there's some caveats I wanted to put up front before I get into that piece of the presentation. I'm going to show you a lot of data that shows that boys are doing particularly terrible relative to females, particularly boys and males of color. One thing that I want you to note is that because I say boys are doing worse than girls on a number of critical indicators does not mean that girls are doing well. I don't want to leave you with that impression that girls are doing good. In fact, in many instances, they're doing very badly. I often describe it as girls are treading water and boys are sinking fast. That's really what's describing these realities. The second thing is that even though we talk about gender here and we pull out analytically the experience of what's happening with males, their lives are inextricably tied to females. So the notion that we're only looking at disadvantage with respect to males and treating them as if they live in a vacuum in terms of how we think about it is not our approach at all. What's happening with males, things like mass incarceration, which is an overwhelmingly male institution, is undermining the well-being of women and children in dramatic fashion. In fact, it rivals other possible pathways of disadvantage in our society. So when we pull it out and we look at the male dynamic associated with it, we're not saying woe is males, we're saying woe is the communities that are affected by what's happening to these males. And the third thing is that you're going to see at the end of this presentation, there's ample evidence, I only present a fraction of it in this presentation, is that disadvantage is gender specific. For a long time, we've thought of disadvantaged boys and girls, say low-income boys and girls in poor communities who go to poor schools, as somehow being a monolith. They have the same problems, and therefore we should apply the same solutions to changing their outcomes. That is not right. That's not supported by the evidence. The evidence increasingly shows that disadvantage operates differently for boys and girls. Its mechanisms are different, and it results in different outcomes. So if we're going to respond effectively to boys and girls, we have to treat them differently. If we want to actually change their outcomes, we cannot treat them the same. The second part of the presentation is where I'm going to present the life course framework proper, the thing that gives name to this presentation. And that's how we wrangle the complexity of what I'm going to talk about in the first half of this presentation, where I'm going to argue in the first half that there's 40 years of evidence shows that we have an intergenerational cycle of disadvantage that's operating gender specifically. And that how we're going to deal with that is how I frame the second half of the presentation, by wrangling the complexity in terms of some key aspects and how we diagnose and understand that problem. And it'll become clear when I present the visuals, at least I hope if they show up, but we'll see, that remains to be seen. So why focus on boys and men of color? The most often reason given for focusing on boys and men of color are gross disparities and particular negative outcomes. Violence, victimization, and offending, crime, and incarceration. These things come up all the time when people say, we got to do something about these boys in these communities. Less talked about, but as equally, if not more important, are the fact that males of color are showing negative or stagnant trends in key opportunity outcomes relative to females. Employment and earnings, high school graduation, college enrollment, and completion. And when we look at this, I'm going to make a note, and I'll spend more time on it when we get there. This phenomenon is not a phenomenon we just see among males of color. It is a phenomenon we see among white boys and white young men as well. But I don't just mean American white boys and white young men. I mean German white boys and white young men. I mean French. I mean South Korean boys, Japanese boys. We are seeing this divergence on a gender basis in these critical outcomes across the industrialized world. We don't entirely know what's driving it, but it's magnified by America's particular matrix of inequalities to produce some very stark realities for boys of color. But this is a phenomenon that is very large in its implications across the globe. And then lastly, that there's a vicious cycle of intergenerational male disadvantage. Disadvantaged families are disproportionately more damaging to male educational outcomes than females. How many people, by the way, just by show of hands, just saw the New York Times article, I think it was about 3 days ago, that talked about in disadvantaged families, boys suffer disproportionately than compared to girls? Okay, so that article and that study in Florida is a validation of precisely this point. But they don't just look at families like I'm going to look at here. They look at multiple disadvantaged contexts and find that boys are more negatively impacted than girls. And this shows up in study and study after study, research after research, in a variety of study designs, and I'll spend more time on that when I get there. So we've seen over the past 40 years a substantial decline in employment and earnings that's been well established by the research literature, and I'm just going to identify the big factors that have been driving it. So the biggest factor contributing to employment and earnings is what's called skill-biased technological change. That's what's in the first box up there. And that's basically computerization. That has automated and replaced quite a few jobs over the past 40 years. It's eliminated what are called middle skill positions for the most part. But we're finding an interesting thing about computerization and the technological displacement of workers. For a long time, we saw the returns to a college education being very significant. The premium on going to college relative to any type of work, other type of worker was extraordinary. However, that premium stopped growing in 2000. And that puzzled economists. Why did the returns to a college education stop growing? Thank you very much. And part of the explanation, one researcher argues, is that it's not so much the college degree itself that produces the premium. It's the college degree plus a job that requires social skills. Social skill jobs that have a college degree have only seen their premium rise over time. They've seen their wages continue to increase. It's the jobs that don't require social skills that even at the highest level of complexity can still be automated by software. So even your accountant, even many people who do complex jobs that require years of training, if it doesn't require social skills, meaning coordination with people in team environments, coordination with clients, things that can't be automated, then they will eventually be replaced by computers. And so his argument is that the reason the returns to college education stopped in the 2000s is because increasingly those jobs that people were trained to do with college degrees are being supplanted by software. And that's an alarming reality. But it speaks to something important that I'm going to talk about in a moment about how important social skills or socio-emotional skills have become in the outcomes of young people. Offshoring of middle-skilled jobs and import competition, the shorthand that we refer to as globalization. The evidence is very clear on what globalization has done. We send jobs overseas, or we allow imports in our country that basically kill that type of employment within our borders, and that's been substantial over the past 40 years. The decline in unions, the suburbanization of low-skilled jobs, what's referred to as spatial mismatch. And that basically refers to the fact that historically, African Americans and Latinos are concentrated in central cities, but most of the low-skilled, low-wage job growth has taken place in the suburbs. And so in metropolitan areas with poor transportation infrastructures, that factor has been a key contributor to the rising unemployment and joblessness among this population. Legal discrimination against felons. That didn't used to be that big a deal because we didn't have that many felons. Now we have a whole bunch because of mass incarceration. So that now takes on an outsized significance in our economy and the growth in unemployment and joblessness. And the last thing is illegal employment discrimination in low-wage jobs. That's still prevalent in the lowest, more prevalent in the lowest end of the labor market, in the unskilled job labor market. And audit studies have consistently shown this. What they found, however, is that race even trumps having a criminal record in that. So a recent audit study in New York City found that a white male recently released from prison, fictitiously, but that was his application information, was more likely to get a call back for a job than a black male who had never had a felony or never been incarcerated. And so even in the lowest wage of the labor market, black or race still is more pernicious and negative to your outcomes than is a criminal record. So what we're looking at here is the joblessness rates, the joblessness trend lines from 1950 to 2010. And there's a couple important things to note about this joblessness trend line. First of all, we just look at native males, because when you're talking about Latinos, when you include the foreign-born who have disproportionately high employment rates, it can make the Latino numbers look better than they would be if we're talking about those who've spent their whole life and grown up in this country. The second thing is joblessness is a different metric from what you normally hear about unemployment. Joblessness is from the US Census. And it means the percentage of people who had no employment in the prior 12 months, I'm sorry. No income from employment in the last 12 months. That's what's called long-term unemployment. That's a very alarming number. That's kind of the worst of the worst. These people have low probabilities of returning to the labor market, and so this is a very troublesome trend line. What we're looking at here is the trend line for African American males. The percentage up there at the top in 2010 is 42%. That means 42% of black men in 2010 had no employment in the prior 12 months, native-born. This is for Latino males, and this is for white males. Latino males, I believe, is 24%, and white males is 17%. Now, folks have often told me, when you look at the shift in those numbers for African Americans, for example, that that 2010 number occurs right in the middle or near a Great Recession. And so, of course, you're going to have those extraordinarily high levels of joblessness. That's true. That does contribute to its elevation. The problem is we've had 7 recessions from 1950 to 2010. And what you see is that those numbers never go back down. They stay sticky at that level. And so I'm not saying that 42% will be the enduring joblessness number for black males for the foreseeable future, but I can assure you that that number will remain sticky around that number, especially since this is one of the worst anemic recoveries from a major recession that we've had in the 20th century, outside of the Great Depression. You're not likely to see those numbers shift dramatically in the near term. And this is heavily concentrated among those who didn't attend college. Those gaps shrink substantially when we're just looking at college graduates, college graduate black males, Latino males, and white males. These are numbers for California. 39% for black males, 26% for Latino males, 25% for white males. It's actually higher in this state for white males. Natives are 37%, Chinese are 16%, and Filipinos are 16% in the state of California in 2010. Along with the shift in employment and earnings has been the rise of mass incarceration that we've seen over the past 40 years. Okay, so this is the historical trend line for the 20th century in mass incarceration. And what you see there is the start of mass incarceration in 1972, and you can see what that trend line does after that. It's actually pretty insane what we did around criminal justice policy starting in the 1970s. We increased our incarceration rate by 430% from 1972 to 2010. And this was driven overwhelmingly by policy decisions. Not by the behavior that we call crime, that we then punish with the rules that we have on the books at the time. We changed the rules dramatically to punish the same event, the same act differently before 1972 as compared to after 1972. We increased the likelihood that you went to prison for a crime compared to whether or not you would have before 1972, and we sent you there for a longer amount of time. You stayed much longer. Truth in sentencing laws, mandatory minimums. These are all the contributors to that incarceration cocktail. It's funny that there was a study in around 1970 that said the United States had a stable equilibrium incarceration rate, which hovered at about where you see that blue line for all of the 20th century. And then, of course, that study is now a laughingstock because we changed the whole equation by our mass incarceration policy starting in 1973. We know from the research evidence that going to prison after you're released, reduces your lifetime earnings by 10 to 30%. And if you add in other variables like race and other considerations, education status and so forth, those numbers become even worse. But what's important about those numbers is that the effect is not driven by the length of stay in prison. It's driven by the felony conviction itself. It's the scarlet letter that drives that outcome once you're released. So if you went to prison for 2 years or you went to prison for 10 years, you still have the same dramatic effects on your long-term outcomes. The reason that's important is because if we cut the prison population in half tomorrow, we still have the same amount of felons. We don't reduce felons to half. We have close to 10 million ex-felons in our country right now who are, for all intents and purposes, unemployable in many respects. They are excluded from virtually every institutional avenue of participation in our society, and that's accepted until recently. And so the problem is we have to mitigate the collateral damage of that long rampage of incarceration. We have to do things that either eliminate the sting of a felony conviction or eliminate the felony conviction itself. Prop 47 is an attempt at that. We took a lot of nonviolent felony offenders and we actually removed felony convictions from their records and allowed them to expunge those misdemeanors, and in turn they are no longer an ex-criminal or a criminal, and they are therefore eligible for a variety of benefits that our society offers. We have to do a variety of things from what are called certificates of rehabilitation to mandatory downgrading of felony convictions after a parole or probation to misdemeanors. There's a variety of tools that are being explored across the country, but it's more than just cutting down the size of the beast. We have to reconcile the fact that there's all this damage in its wake that is lasting on people's lives. So I wanted to show what we got for our money, if you will, in terms of mass incarceration. Over the past 25 years, homicides have declined by 54%, rape by 40%, robbery by 60%, assaults by 47%, and yet incarceration has gone up by 53% in that amount of time. Now, it used to be the argument that, well, this is because that happened. We reduced that because of this. Well, it turns out that incarceration has had zero effect on the decline of violent crime since 1990. If you just go back the past 20 years, and you did what are called a scatter plot, you just put them all up there on the axis, what you see is that they're entirely uncorrelated. An increase in incarceration is entirely uncorrelated with a decrease in violent crime in a state. If you decompose this at a state level, you have most of the states fit into two profiles. They increased incarceration dramatically and had no effect on their violent crime rate, or they decreased incarceration dramatically while violent crime rates decreased more rapidly or as fast as they decreased incarceration. Two things that ostensibly should not happen if incarceration actually reduces violent crimes. And that's most prisoners in the United States are in states where that occurred. So mass incarceration is one of the most expensive blunders from a policy standpoint that we've engaged in US history, and its return on investment is not only laughable in terms of its desired output, which is to reduce violent crime, the collateral consequences that flow from it are enormous. We have to pay in all other kinds of ways for the failure of mass incarceration. These are the incarceration rates for the state of California. No, these are actually the share of incarceration rates of the prison population in California by race for men between the ages of 18 and 71. And we see there that 25% of black men, the prison population is 25% black men, 43% Latino men, 27% white men, and less than 1% each of Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Asians. But these are the incarceration rates. And the important thing about these incarceration rates that I want to point out is not just the fact that African Americans' incarceration rates per 100,000 are extraordinarily high relative to other populations, but that the incarceration rates for Latinos seem remarkably low in comparative terms to African Americans. And I haven't parsed the data because I haven't yet gotten the data, but I use national data and some back-of-the-envelope calculations to reconcile something important that I think is lurking behind the numbers we see with respect to Latinos and their incarceration rates. When advocates who are doing prison reform or criminal justice reform look at the rates, they say Latinos are about 42% of the California population. They're about 43% of the state prison population. That's even. That's not called disproportionality, is what they say. The problem, though, is that the people who are Latino inside prisons are very different from the people outside of prison who are Latino. And what I mean by that is the vast majority using national data of people inside prison are native-born Latinos. They're about 70% native-born Latinos. But outside of that population, in the state of California, males are about 70% foreign-born Latinos. So if you're taking those inside as the numerator and those outside as the denominator, you're actually comparing two very different populations. If I take the native-born population inside prison and compare that to the native-born population outside of prison, just as the back-of-the-envelope calculation, that incarceration rate doubles and looks a lot more like African Americans. The point being, the longer you're here in this country, the longer you go to schools in this country, the longer you experience the matrix of disadvantages that America has to offer, the more your numbers look like what they look like for African Americans with respect to mass incarceration. So this is what that reality produces. This number right here. 70% of black males who drop out of high school will go to prison in their lifetimes in the United States. But I want to point out this number. Only 21% of black males who get their high school diploma or their GED will go to prison in their lifetimes. So for black males, a high school diploma is literally a ticket out of prison in a way that's not comparable for other population groups. That gradient of difference, 47 percentage points, is extraordinary for a black male. Unfortunately, it's 90% in California. So if you're a black male who drops out of high school, you have a virtual certainty of going to prison in your lifetime. And it's less if you get a high school diploma. It actually declines. The benefit, the protective benefit of being a high school graduate increases to 78 percentage points difference for a black male who graduates from high school versus one who drops out in this state. So along with the shift in the economy and employment and the rise in mass incarceration has been the rise of disadvantaged families. Now, when you talk about disadvantaged families, it puts you squarely in an old kind of culture warrior debate from the 90s about who's to blame for poverty and the realities of what's going on in America. And oftentimes the argument was, it's poor people and their bad values. And Charles Murray is probably one of the best exponents of this idea. And he's basically argued that it's bad values that led to the rise in single-parent families, and that to correct that problem, we need to give good values to the people with bad values. And he argued that mostly around African Americans in the 1980s and the 1990s, particularly focused on the welfare reform debate. And then he wrote a book called Coming Apart recently where he says that bad values problem is metastasized to white folks. And they're doing the same thing that black folks did. And that's why we've seen this precipitous rise in single-parent families among white families. Now, this great researcher named Andrew Cherlin took on that thesis squarely and analyzed census data from 1880 all the way up to 2010, 130 years of census data, to assess Charles Murray's thesis about whether or not bad values and its historical timing is the explanation for why we've seen the rise in single-parent families. And what he found is basically Charles Murray's thesis doesn't hold water for a variety of reasons. The first part being the traditional two-parent family that Charles Murray is talking about is a historical anomaly. The traditional family that Charles Murray is talking about is a family where a father goes out in the labor force and earns a living, and the wife stays home and takes care of the kids. The father's the breadwinner, the mother does the domestic labor that's not compensated in the labor market. What Cherlin found is that family type didn't even emerge for the first time until the 1880s. We didn't actually see a family type like that because the predominant family type during the agrarian era was one where mothers and fathers stayed home on the farm and the whole family worked on the farm. There was no separation of work and family space. But that shifted with the Industrial Revolution and industrialization of the United States and people moving to cities. But what Chandler found is that the family type, these traditional family type with the male breadwinner and the mother who stays home, didn't really become a predominant family type until the 1950s. And at peak, it comprised only 55% of white families. That's the highest reach that family model has attained in American society. And so he analyzed the context that sustained that type of family model, where one person's earnings could sustain a family in a middle-class way for people who mostly didn't have college educations, who mostly just had high school educations. And what he found is the context that explained it was the generous economic expansion after World War II from 1945 to 1975 that sustained that family model. And when that economy fell apart in the 1970s, so did that family model, particularly for white folks. And what he found is that across the income spectrum, from the very top earners to the bottom earners, everybody from 1945 to 1975 saw their real income double during that time. Since that time, most of those who are in the bottom half have seen their real earnings decline, and decline substantially when we're talking about men. And so the basic premise is that the two-family model where the mother stays home and provides the domestic labor is a historically specific model tied to a certain economy. And so as that economy fell apart, so did that family model for white folks. And that family model never fully took hold for African Americans because they were never fully integrated into that explosive economy until the economy started to come to an end. The civil rights movement in the 1960s, the expansion of all these opportunities in employment, housing, education, you name it, when those finally took hold, the industrial economy that was supporting and nurturing that growth fell apart. Those jobs started disappearing in rapid numbers from our economy. And so African Americans never joined into that, and that's why the emergence of single-parent families was a much earlier occurrence for them. We know from a recent study that there is just a sheer imbalance because of mass incarceration and because of employment prospects in the amount of males there are to females in communities. The New York Times Upshot Department did a study of the nation and found that there are only 83 black men who are neither dead or in jail between the ages of 25 and 54 for every black woman in that age range. So in this critical earnings, likelihood of getting married age range, there are literally 17 fewer black men for every 100 black women. But we know from studies when they look at this that it's more concentrated at the local level. So they pulled out and analyzed Ferguson and found that the number is only 60 to 100. There are literally only 60 black men in that age range for every black woman. So the idea that you can sustain as a predominant family model, a two-parent family, when there's literally not enough people to match up is remarkable. But we know that this ratio is concentrated even further in the worst neighborhoods in our communities. If you go to the poorest neighborhoods in your city, you'll likely see these ratios being 50 to 100, 2 to 1 black men for every black woman. And so the ability to sustain a family model that we've grown accustomed to as a traditional ideal model is undermined by the fact that we literally don't have the demographic realities to support that. And we know from the research that incarceration reduces and continues to reduce male parental involvement after fathers are released from prison. So the percentage of children living in a single-parent family, 1 in 5 white children, almost a third of Latino children, and more than half of black children. And for Asian children, it's about 13%. So they're actually to the left of white children in terms of that risk. So why does this matter? Particularly, why does family disadvantage matter? Because the evidence shows us that it has gender-specific effects on family disadvantage, gender-specific effects on the outcomes for males who grow up in those families relative to the girls who grow up in those families. Oops. Okay, research shows that growing up in a single-parent family reduces college attendance for boys, but not for girls. That a father's absence increases juvenile delinquency among boys, but not for girls. And juvenile delinquency is strongly predictive of educational and economic outcomes. That growing up in a single-parent family increases behavior problems significantly more among boys than girls, and behavior problems are a significant predictor of educational outcomes and later employment outcomes. We also know that father's education matters a lot for boys. A father who graduates from high school reduces juvenile delinquency for their boys, but not for their girls. Boys are less likely to complete college than their sisters if their father is either absent or less educated than their mothers. Fathers' incarceration impacts boys more negatively than girls. Boys are twice as likely as girls to show an increase in externalizing behavior when their fathers are incarcerated. And externalizing behavior refers to aggressive behavior, which is a strong predictor of negative educational outcomes and later employment outcomes. But these are all correlational studies. They are correlational studies done with a variety of statistical techniques to give us something that's a better approximation of causality, but they're still correlational. So there's various biases associated with them. The best studies that we have to look at, these are not the best ones. These are just one among dozens of studies that I could show you that show what's called affect heterogeneity around gender. What we see with these social experiments is that consistently, when you change the context of disadvantaged boys and girls respond by doing better along the predicted or the expected pathways, and boys often not only don't do well, but they often do worse. They actually have negative outcomes when they go to better neighborhoods and better schools. We saw this in the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which took 4,500 families across the country from 6 cities in the poorest public housing projects in those cities, in the poorest neighborhoods. And what they did is they gave those families vouchers to move out of high poverty neighborhoods, greater than 40% poverty, or I think it's greater than 30% poverty, into neighborhoods with low poverty levels, below 10%. And the theory was that if we take families out of these high poverty neighborhoods, put them in low poverty neighborhoods, the kids will respond by getting better grades and doing better in school and being overall having better well-being. What they found in terms of the follow-up studies for 15 years is that it didn't actually have that effect. We didn't see positive effects overall for kids. We saw some positive effects for mothers, but in the aggregate, it was a wash. But they did find one divergence in positive and negative effects, one important but limited positive effect, and that's girls responded when they moved to better neighborhoods by seeing improved behavior and school engagement, whereas boys actually saw worse school engagement and behavior. They saw worse outcomes when they moved to better neighborhoods. Now, when the follow-up study was done on this experiment at the 15-year mark, they said it was basically a wash. Moving to Opportunity does not have appeared to work. And then this great guy named Raj Chetty came along at Harvard who used a data set that is unprecedented, I think, in social research, where he was able to use IRS data on 10 million kids, and he was able to match that data to the sample used in the MTO study and look at the youngest kids that weren't part of the last follow-up. He looked at the kids who were only 7 or only 9, who were only 3 when they moved from a worse neighborhood to a better neighborhood. And what he found is that if kids moved to a better neighborhood when they were younger than 13, they had a linear yearly dose-response relationship and improved likelihood of better outcomes by the age 26 by moving to that better neighborhood. They were less likely to be a teenage parent. They were more likely to complete college, and they were more likely to earn substantially better than their counterparts who moved after age 13. If they moved after age 13, when they entered adolescence, they either had no positive effect or a negative effect. So there's this adolescence dividing line in this social experiment that found when kids get a better environment before 13, they improve substantially in a dose-response relationship. But after 13, oftentimes the damage can be done. And how we mitigate that damage becomes another question. It only means that just simply dropping kids in a different environment is not the solution to that problem. More is needed. But this is a sobering real illustration of just how important context is. Because once you hit a certain age, context can no longer benefit you substantially. And that's a remarkable finding. So this shows up in some of the longer-term trend lines we see in high school graduation rates by race and gender from 1970 to 2010. This is the high school graduation trend line for white girls, who are approaching 90% high school graduation in 2010. And these numbers, by the way, exclude GEDs, and they focus on the native-born. So by excluding GEDs, we have a better sense of actually what the trend lines in high school graduation look like. This is white boys who actually graduated higher than white girls before 1970, and then a gap has opened up and remained persistent ever since. This is black girls who now graduate from high school at a rate equal to white boys from that deficit in 1970. And this is black boys. Now, black girls have graduated from high school at a higher rate than black boys since before the Great Depression. That's a long-standing gender gap. But that gap always remained fairly close. It's only in the past 40 years that it's opened up to this gap, this chasm that we see here. And this is Latino girls. From that deficit in 1970 to reaching almost parity with white boys and black girls in 2010. And this is Latino boys who actually graduated at a higher rate than Latino girls before 1970. They switched places in the 70s, and a sizable gap has opened up and remained persistent. Now, again, as I emphasize, this gap that we're seeing across racial groups in America is also being replicated across the industrialized world. We are seeing girls perform better academically in high school, primary and secondary schooling relative to boys, and boys are stagnant. And there's no simple answer why. As for any good problem, there's no simple answer why. It's actually a whole bunch of contributing factors. So when you put these pieces together, we have the makings of a vicious cycle of intergenerational disadvantage. Declining employment and earnings, abetted by the mass incarceration and the war on drugs, both independently contribute to the growth of disadvantaged families, which we just saw has gender-specific effects on the outcomes for boys relative to girls in those families, producing stagnant educational attainment, and you have an intergenerational cycle. Limited employment and earnings, likelihood of going to prison raises the probability that that male will then start a family that dissolves and in turn result in stagnant educational outcomes for their sons. But we know from the research data that this phenomenon is concentrated in neighborhoods of disadvantaged poverty, of concentrated poverty, that we saw emerge for the first time also in the 1970s. There's a lot of confluence in these broad trends. The rise in inequality, the rise in economic segregation, all of these trends overlap each other in time, historically, and they converge in place to magnify their negative consequences. We know that when you concentrate poverty, you concentrate everything associated with poverty, like crime, violence, poor school quality, drugs, and disinvestment. And we also know that these neighborhoods are the neighborhoods overwhelmingly from which we pull our incarcerated population. We take kids and young folks out of these neighborhoods, young men out of these neighborhoods, and we return 40% of them out of state prisons every year, back to these neighborhoods that they come from, overwhelmingly. And so we are, through that state policy, producing an extraordinary level of residential instability in the most vulnerable neighborhoods in America. And that's our policies doing that. And we've known since the 1920s that a contextual factor that's strongly predictive of negative developmental outcomes for children is people moving in and out of a community with high frequency. So that's the cycle, and that's the kind of sobering, not particularly encouraging news about the intersection of these broad structural forces. The life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations, this second part that I'm going to have to go through a little quicker, is about how we wrangle that complexity in order to understand it and interrupt it. There are three major components to the life course framework, and you're going to see these represented visually in just a moment, but I want to give you a sense of the building blocks that comprise this. We have dimensions of human development, and this is what we start with in our lives, including our genetics, and what develops over our lives, our physical health, our cognitive development, our mental health, our socio-emotional development as examples. And then you have our life course outcomes, the school readiness, high school graduation, incarceration, stable full-time employment, et cetera. These are the things that I call above the hood, because we track these very well. Maybe not school readiness as well as we should, but these other ones we track pretty well. People run for office on some of these outcomes. They try and claim victories or success on some of these outcomes. Researchers study these outcomes pretty extensively. If you're looking at a research study, they're often going to say, how does this matter to one of these things? So this is the above the hood stuff. But it's this below the hood stuff that we don't track very well. We often don't have any clue what's going on with a particular child or children in our schools around these things. We don't know that the reason that that young boy is not sitting still in the fourth grade is because he was traumatized when he was 3. We don't have that data. And so we see behavior and we respond with something over here called school discipline. We're not responding to the underlying factor that is embedded in their dimensions of human development. And so it's the unfortunate reality that because we don't track this well, we don't respond to it, we don't serve it particularly well. We've built a whole system of education around prizing cognitive development above all else, and we'll find in just a moment why that has been problematic, particularly as we've shifted from an industrial to a post-industrial society. And the last thing are the ecological and contextual factors. These are the exposures to environmental and experiential factors, both proximate and distal, family close to us, metropolitan area far away, distal, that shape both human development and life course outcomes, that bear down on both of these things, our families, our neighborhoods, our schools, our public systems, et cetera. So let's look quickly at dimensions of human development. I'm going to list all these off, and then I'm going to highlight a couple just for their importance to this discussion around how we interrupt these cycles. Physical health, cognitive development, mental health and sense of well-being, socio-emotional development, identity development, content and cultural knowledge accumulation, moral development, and personality. Now, everything up here is associated with a study and or studies that says these predict later life outcomes. These predict those life course outcomes, those above the board things that we track all the time, high school graduation, whether we get a job, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some important things I want you to note about this. And I want to point out something related to physical health and then cognitive development and socio-emotional development. Physical health, the research literature has exploded in showing that diversity during childhood becomes biologically embedded. We've thought for a long time and focused on behaviors that we think are problematic from a health standpoint. We now know with increasing evidence that experiencing adversity, chronic, toxic adversity early in our lives gets under our skin in a way that alters our biological systems in enduring ways where we can detect it by age 40. We can detect a year of sustained adversity in someone's body when they're 45. We can see the vestiges of that far down the road. And what we found is that there's two primary pathways. There's what's called a neuroendocrine pathway that affects this thing called the HPA axis. I won't get into it, but essentially makes the point that children who are chronically stressed produce hormones that actually undermine their brain development and their brain functioning. And one of the most important things that it does is it impairs working memory. And working memory is the most critical element to learning, to reasoning and learning. So we actually, when we expose kids to chronic stress in their schools, in their neighborhoods, in their families, it undermines their ability to learn. And the evidence around this is exploding and is enduring. Neuroendocrine is one pathway. Another pathway we've learned about is what's called epigenetics. We found that when kids get exposed to chronic adversity, it doesn't change their genes, it just turns some of them off. So epigenome is kind of a layer over our genetic code that uses chemicals to activate genes. Genes themselves are somewhat inert unless they're transcribed to actually act. And our epigenome is what does that. Adversity can actually cause our epigenome to shut off and produce problematic configurations in our genetic expression, as they call it, which can result in enduring negative effects way in life, some of which are neurodevelopmental. And so the evidence is clear that negative experiences are harmful in an enduring way at a biological level. Second, I want to point out that we spend so much effort in our educational system, and the standards-based accountability movement, even Common Core, speaks to this idea that we want to boost cognitive development and the substance of what kids learn. Because the premise is that that is the most important thing to their later life outcomes. Evidence is increasingly showing that that's not the case. That socio-emotional development is as important, if not more important, to later life outcomes than cognitive development. And as I mentioned, since 2002, the returns, the premium for cognitive skills have only eroded for those who don't work in jobs that require socio-emotional skills. And so socio-emotional development, which is extremely sensitive to adversity, is being undermined and is very important to later life outcomes for a whole bunch of children. But cognitive development is what we've built our system around. We don't focus on the need to establish attachment between a teacher and a student, which opens up every capacity of that child to learn. We focused on making sure that the stuff they're cramming in their heads is up to code. And that's the problem with our broader systems of how we create opportunity and ignore a lot of this stuff that's under the hood, prizing one particular dimension to the neglect of others. You can think about these dimensions of human development as being on like an equalizer, like this. And each of these equalizer corresponds to cognitive development or social-emotional reasoning, et cetera. And when the slide is up at the top, it's a protective factor. And when it's down at the bottom, it's a risk factor. And at any particular point in time, a person is at some configuration on this equalizer in terms of their dimensions of human development that are driving their outcomes at that moment. Okay, this is normally black with a bunch of dots, and now it's white. So we'll see what doesn't pop up. This is kind of fun, actually. So you can think of this equalizer as a capsule of a human being. And as this capsule of a human being moves across the life course, different parts of that capsule become sensitive at different times. Cognitive development, our brains are extremely plastic in the first couple years of our lives, the first 5 years of our lives. Our prefrontal cortex is also extremely plastic during adolescence, which we are increasingly recognizing. So kids' brains are actually often developing slower than their responsibilities, which is a part of the reason why adolescence is so risky in America compared to other countries. And so as it moves along, you have different levels of sensitivity of those slides to what's going on around it. This is the life course canvas that we use. It looks different from this, but this is it. And we have off-track and on-track outcomes across this life course. And that's on-track or off-track to some important later life outcome, some critical thing that we're trying to aim for. It could be high school graduation. It could be college completion. It could be, in the case of my work and the work of a lot of folks that I work with, stable full-time employment at 300% federal poverty level earnings. A middle-class, family-supporting wage, stable middle-class, family-supporting wage that we've treated as the most important on-track indicator. And these are on-track or off-track to that. But you can pick whatever is your end result here. And then these are age spans: 0 to 5, early childhood; 6 to 11, middle childhood; 12 to 18, adolescence; 19 to 25, emerging adulthood; and 26 to 35, what's called early adulthood. And those are terms of art that correspond to how the literature often organizes these age ranges and talks about it. And then you have the ecological contextual factors that I mentioned earlier that we're going to come back to quickly in a second to show you. Preterm or low birth weight is this first one, as an off-track indicator that's strongly predictive of, strongly predictive of later life outcomes. This one is secure attachment up top as the on-track outcome, insecure attachment at the bottom as the off-track outcome. This is proficient fourth grade math and reading and socio-emotional skills, not proficient in fourth grade math and reading. Oh, I'm sorry, that was school ready and not school ready. Excuse me, because that's at age 5. School ready and not school ready. And I don't know if this is helpful, just seeing dots up there and me say stuff, is it? It's not, right? So I'm going to skip this. You guys will get this, by the way, so you can look at these. But these are, by the way, things that that me and my colleague distilled down from the research of what of these outcome milestones are strongly predictive of later life outcomes. And here are some others, which are also blocked out, so I'm gonna skip that. And that's very important right there, so you'll have to look at it yourself and come back to it. Let me leave you with an important point here before I wrap up. The life course that we looked at are these outcomes across the life course that you can now see up there. That's what it looks like when you can see it. And you can see all the key milestones across the life course that are critical to long-term health and outcomes. And this is, say, hypothetically, the life course for a mother or a father. Now, we know from the research, from the data, demographic data from the feds, that 65% of black males, black and Latino males who are going to have children in their lifetime, have their first child by the time they're 25. 90% of those who are unmarried, 85% if they get married, or 85% overall, have their first child by the time they're age 30. They, on average, have 2 or fewer kids, roughly 5 years apart in general. So most of the next generation of children are being born at these milestones and having these milestones at the same time that their fathers or mothers are having these critical early developmental milestones. So getting a father a job, getting a father a post-secondary credential, keeping him out of prison are early childhood interventions. Those are driving their children's outcomes. Those are the reason that the best result we get from early childhood interventions are limited and constrained by all these factors that are happening with their parents. Early childhood is necessary, absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. Early childhood interventions. We're so far behind that we thought that that is the only thing we should be doing. That is something that we should and absolutely should be doing, but it's not enough. These other factors that are happening with parents are driving negative outcomes. We know, for example, that a child with an incarcerated father not only has bad outcomes, if that child goes to a school with other incarcerated fathers, the kids who don't have an incarcerated father do poorer in those schools because of all these kids with incarcerated fathers. Meaning that the kids who don't have a parent in the criminal justice system have spillover effects on their outcomes by attending schools with a high proportion of kids who do have fathers incarcerated. And so these outcomes, the interrelationships, are not just intergenerational, they're spilling over to the environment that are shaping the outcomes of kids who go to school with, live in neighborhoods with the kids of these young folks. And so we have to think about how we intervene in a dual generation strategy and not just in a single generation approach. Now, I'm way past time. I meandered a couple points. So I'm gonna have to stop here and take some questions. But you will get, I'll make sure everybody here gets a chance to look at the slide deck. I think Dave said it will be going out. And so you'll have a chance to see a lot of what you couldn't see here in clear fashion. But let me stop now for questions for folks who have everything burning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold. And we will be sure to to make sure we distribute the slide deck for everyone to see it up close and personal, because it is very powerful. We have time for maybe 1-2 questions, and I'd love to see the hands in the air. Yes. There's a mic right there for you.
Sorry, I might not need it. Marcia Bonner from the Annenberg Foundation, previously at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and we heard Mr. Chandler's results, and I know for a fact that over at the Policy Link Conference, downtown dueling conferences, they're talking about My Brother's Keeper and also the Boys and Men of Color Initiative and how the life force outcomes are being used to actually track where people are going, where these young people are going. Can you just give a little bit of context for how this work is being used around the country? Because it's groundbreaking work and it is proving effective.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I would say it's filtered in a bunch of different ways into a bunch of different areas of work and activity. There's a lot of networks going on across the country. The Opportunity Youth Network, we got the Cities United work, we got the MBK Alliance, the National Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. We have a California Executives Alliance. There's a lot of different folks that are working on this population, either explicitly or in terms of the factors that they're trying to change are clearly working on this population, if not explicitly. And so this work has filtered into some of that work in terms of me speaking at their conferences, in some cases me doing webinars and TA. But for the most part, I've been working with philanthropy, I've been working with these networks, but the areas in which I've seen this penetrate the most is actually cities and counties. And so we've had cities ask us to come in and do a strategic, using this framework, recognizing that it's focused on males of color, because as I mentioned, this is applicable to any disadvantaged population. We can apply it accordingly. But a lot of folks recognize that males of color are a critical factor in what's driving outcomes in their communities. And so they use this framework, and they've actually asked us to come in and do strategic planning across all their agencies, and for the first time, do strategies for their cities using this approach. Plugging the data in, thinking about interventions, because what that presentation you just saw is, it's all problem analysis. I'm not coming to anybody and saying, I've got the problem you need to focus on, and here's the solution you need to focus on. I'm saying I got a whole bunch of problems organized in a way that I hope is useful for you. And then there's a whole lot of data and intel from your local area you need to populate this, to get this to work for you, because this is a general story that needs to be applied. What does your high school graduation rate look like? What does your incarceration rate look like? We know in the state of California, if you get arrested for the same felony, you have a radical different likelihood of going to prison if you live in San Bernardino County than you do if you live in Alameda County. So that reality changes what your numbers are going to look like in terms of how you're driving things. And so what we're telling these cities is, we need your data to be plugged into here, tell your local story, and then pick your interventions. Then we'll tell you what the evidence basis is on policy and program changes, because we have that too, but we keep that off the table until we get folks to fully embrace the complexity of the challenge before them, and not just say, let's pick one problem and one solution and throw our might at that and hope for the best. And we're challenging cities, we're challenging county governments. LA County has formally adopted this framework, I was informed, in their proposed model for their MBK plan for the LA County MBK process. So LA County is pursuing an MBK strategy, and I presented this at their summit, and they're thinking about how they can use this across not only multiple county departments, but across the 56 cities that are in this LA County. And so that's the place where the rubber hits the road the best in some ways, that I'm most pleased about and that has the most promise. But the philanthropy work has been more entrepreneurial, about trying to connect the dots across all these various networks. And so that's the other promising dimension of it. There's MBK out of the White House, which is fantastic. There's the MBK National Executives Alliance, but it's how we get all these folks operating from the same playbook that the life course framing is starting to serve at least as a bridge for that. And hopefully that will bear fruit down the road. But that's where it seems to be playing out the most. Thank you.
One closing question.
On the data with the single parents and the effects on young men and boys, is there any data about whether that parent is the father or the mother? Is there a differential there as far as the effect on the young men?
Yeah, it turns out two things. It turns out that the vast majority of single-parent families are mothers, so that's obviously what's driving it in terms of the populations. It turns out that the absence of either a mother or father result in negative outcomes for boys. So boys apparently need greater parental investments in two parents, more than girls do. Why that is, I don't know. The evidence doesn't tease out the mechanisms by which that operates. I haven't seen evidence that says boys with a single father do better comparatively than boys with a single mother. Just those two isolated comparatives. And because the sample of single fathers are so relatively small, I wouldn't trust those comparisons that way. But the best message to leave with is that boys need two parents very badly for their development relative to girls, relative to the daughters. Is that it?
Unfortunately.
All right, thank you very much.